Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's event. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Programs on Global Affairs, African and African American Studies, and Russian and Eurasian Studies here at George Mason University. We're now over 2 months since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, expanding a criminal war that it began in 2014. Every day since has seemed to bring new horrors. And scholars and even some countries rightly use now the word genocide to describe Russia's violence in Ukraine. Here at George Mason, our program has undertaken a series of conversations to help our community better understand the war and its background. We're fortunate in the age of Zoom and the age of distance meetings to be able to learn from the experts across the country and around the world. In fact, our professional association, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, keeps a calendar of online events related to Russia's war on Ukraine. And I find myself attending some panel discussion or another, it seems nearly every day. So we're happy to have you here today. We're going to use the Q&A function on Zoom for you to ask questions of our speaker. You're welcome to add those questions at any time while our speaker is talking. In addition, I just wanted to let you know about a course that I'm going to be teaching here at George Mason in the fall. It's History 388. It's going to be a course on the war on Ukraine in historical perspective. We're going to try to see what we can do to make sense of the war by looking at historical examples. We hope to bring a series of speakers from around the country and around the world as part of that course. It'll be a fully online course in the fall, and I'll put a link to information about the course in the chat. This is our last event that we're hosting this semester, but we do hope to continue the conversations because we think they're so important. So for now, let me introduce my colleague from the Program in Global Affairs, Niklas Hultin, who will introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you, Steve. And let me quickly introduce our speaker. So Kimberly St. Julian Varnon is a PhD student in history and a presidential PhD fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. And her dissertation research studies the experiences of Africans and African Americans in the Soviet Union and the German Democratic Republic to analyze the forms and functions of race in raceless, in scare quote, socialist societies. And without further ado, I'm gonna hand the floor over or turn the floor over to Kimberly. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Hultin. My professor is Swarthmore when I was a little, undergrad from Texas, learning the ropes about college. Thank you all for being here. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll have a better understanding of some of the nuances of what we've seen in the war in Ukraine, the second part of the war in Ukraine that started February 24th. So I'm going to share my screen, which I'm sure we're all used to this part of sharing the screen and trying to figure out how everything works. There we go. So the name of my talk today is To Be Seen, Blackness in the Russian War in Ukraine. And so what I have to start off by saying is this is a very personal topic to me. So these two pictures are from me in Odessa on the left and Kiev on the right in summer 2013. I'm showing my age. When I was ending my first year as a master's student at Harvard, and I was working on my master's thesis, which studied the Holodomor, the Soviet forced and created famine in Ukraine in 1932. And so it was my first trip to the former Soviet Union. I'd been to Serbia, I'd been to Bulgaria, I'd lived in England, but I'd never been to the place I'd studied. And so this is my first time, the only time I'd been able to go to Ukraine. And I fell in love with this country. And so when I talk about being Black in Ukraine, it comes from personal experience, but it also comes from the heart of my research. And that research on African American and African experiences in the Soviet Union comes from my personal experiences. And so I don't know how many of you knew this before it showed up on the news when the war started, but I had no idea that there were Afro-Ukrainians or Africans living in Ukraine until I went there. And I literally ran into an Afro-Ukrainian woman in the street. We were on Kreshchatyk, so the main thoroughfare in Kiev, and I was coming from the archives. She was walking towards me, and we ran towards each other, just hugged each other. And I spoke Russian then, and I asked her, what are you doing here? And she said, what are you doing here? And that's how I discovered that there were Afro-Ukrainians. And so since then, since that fateful meeting in July 2013, I've wanted to understand, what was it like to be a person who looked like me in the former Soviet Union, but also in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, in Russia, in East Germany? What was it like? Because these countries had a socialist ideology that said that racism was a product of capitalism. So technically, in a socialist society, there should not be racism because there is no capitalism. So when we get to the story, well, the history of the images that we see on the news, particularly when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the treatment of African students and residents of Ukraine along the border, I think we have to give some context to what happened before. Because for many people, these instances of racism along the border that Ukraine shares with Poland were the first time they were aware of an African or Afro-Ukrainian presence in Ukraine. But the presence of Africans and people of African descent has been in Ukraine in particular for decades. So we can go back to the Soviet period. So a key turning point in Soviet history, if many of you know, is the first 5-year plan. So after Lenin dies in 1924, around 1928, we have Stalin pushing to industrialize the country, but also to change, have a significant amount of cultural change in the Soviet Union. But one of the problems was the Soviet Union did not have as many technical specialists and specially trained workers as it needed to undergo this process. And so you see a lot of recruitment from Western countries, including the United States. And this also included African Americans. So some of the first Black people we had in Ukraine who visited Ukraine and worked in Ukraine were African Americans. Many of them stopped in Ukraine on the way to Soviet Uzbekistan to work in Soviet agriculture and cotton production there, or to go to Moscow or Stalingrad and other places within the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic to work in mechanical engineering and things like that. But 1957, so post-World War II, is really when we start seeing an influx of African residents coming to the Soviet Union. So by the 1950s, Khrushchev is in power, Stalin's dead, and you have a turn from a focus on American racial issues, which still are a focus in the Soviet Union, but the power, the money, the influence of the Soviet Union is really dedicated towards decolonizing countries, particularly on the African continent. So 1957 is really one of these turning points. It's where we have the International Socialist Youth Festival. So this is the kind of the first time we see a large influx of African students coming to the Soviet Union after this festival. And so you have that situation where African students are coming, they're coming to study. Many of them study in Ukraine and they study in the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. They also study in Central Asia, depending on what they're interested in. A lot of agricultural specialists were in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where people who were focused more on technology and technical training were in Russia and in Ukraine. So then you have a second wave of African students coming to the Soviet Union around 1980, where you have the Moscow Olympics. So you have this another influx of African residents. So throughout these decades, from 1920 through 1980, we have the Soviet Union projecting itself as an anti-racist country. And really, we have to think of anti-racism in this period, not as a 2022 understanding of anti-racism, but more race neutrality. Considering you have Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan in America, Soviet anti-racism would look like we don't have segregation, we don't have racism here. So that's kind of how they approach the topic within the Soviet Union. So many African students, when they go to the Soviet Union, they're studying, they're working, but you start seeing some interesting conversations happening in the 1960s. And I want to say around 1964 is you have the murder of an African student who was allegedly in a relationship with a white Russian Soviet woman. And so around the 1960s, you start seeing letters in the archives, and Julia Hessler's a really amazing work on this, of African students writing and complaining to their various embassies about being physically harassed and being, verbally assaulted by Soviet citizens who were angry at them, calling them racial slurs, accosting them. So you start seeing elements of racism and anti-Black discrimination bubbling up well before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But you still have this idea of the Soviet Union as this great race neutral place. And so this is kind of the background. So when we think about African students in Ukraine and in Russia and the former Soviet Union, this is not new. This goes back to a decades-long history, over 80 years of history of a Black presence in Ukraine, particularly using and working at Ukrainian educational institutions. But from these African residents and students in Ukraine in the Soviet period, you start having a generation of Afro-Ukrainians. So this picture is of Jean Belanuk. He is a gold medalist in Greco-Roman wrestling. He won the delayed Summer Olympics in Greco-Roman wrestling, and he's Ukrainian. And he blew up on the news because he did the horilka, like the Ukrainian national dance, the one you have to have really good knee joints for, and I totally can't do it. And he's also a member of the Verkhovna Rada. He's part of, the Ukrainian government. He's the only Black member of parliament. And so he is kind of representing this first and second generation of Afro-Ukrainians. And he was born and raised in Ukraine. His father was an African student who stayed in Ukraine and ended up going back to his native country. I think it was Angola, and he actually died in a plane crash in Africa. But he's raised in Ukraine. He speaks Ukrainian, he speaks Russian, and he represented Ukraine in the Olympics. And so when a lot of people think about Ukraine, they don't think about faces like his. They tend to portray Ukraine as only white, and that erases this really fascinating and centuries-long history of Ukraine as a multicultural place, but also kind of a space where you see multiple religions and ethnicities interacting and coexisting together. So when we think about the war in Ukraine, and these two maps are thanks to the Institute for the Study of War, who've been doing really amazing work on the war in Ukraine, who do these daily updates. And so when I'm talking about, African students in Ukraine and the foreign students in Ukraine, this map kind of helps you understand where I'm talking about. So the picture on the left is from April 25th, so yesterday, and the picture on the right is of March 3rd. So March 3rd, we'd be about over a week into the war, and this is really when we're starting to see this influx of people trying to cross the border, the western border here between Ukraine and Poland. So if you look at all the red, so these are assessed Russian-controlled Ukrainian territories. So when I start telling you names of places where African students are studying and foreign students are studying, you can look on the map and see. So some of the most popular places for people to study. Kharkiv. So where's Kharkiv? So Kharkiv is here. Luhansk, Odessa, Kherson, Dnipro, Zaporozhye, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kyiv, Lviv. Most of those places are in red. So at the beginning of this war, you have thousands, I believe that according to the Ukrainian state government as of 2020, I believe, there were over 76,000 foreign students studying in Ukraine when the war started. And so we have to keep that in mind. That is of a country that has a population of over 40 million. So it's not a huge number of people, but it is a pretty sizable portion of the population who are foreign students. But beyond that, these students come from over 155 countries and nations. Over 18,000 of them are from India. Many, and following that, you have many from Morocco, from Nigeria, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, China, Turkey, Cameroon, Kenya. So you have a very wide breadth of foreign students. But what a lot of people don't know is why are foreign students important to Ukraine, but also the long presence of foreign students in Ukraine. For Ukraine, particularly after the 2014 initial Russian invasion in the east, in Luhansk and Donetsk, and the forced annexation of Crimea, you had a very large drop-off of foreign students coming to Ukraine for about 3 or 4 years. And then that number started increasing around 2017, 2018. And so these foreign students, not only are they studying in Ukraine because Ukraine has some of the best technical and medical training outside of the EU, it also has much easier visa regimes for these foreign students to use. And so you have these two benefits for foreign students of why they would go to Ukraine, because many people don't think about that. But Ukraine has long welcomed foreign students and has continued to have high levels of medical and standard technical education training than other countries. But another element of this is, what do foreign students bring to Ukraine? Well, foreign students add a considerable amount to the Ukrainian GDP. roughly about every foreign student spends about $7,000 American in the Ukrainian economy. They're buying food, they're paying rent, they're going out, they're watching movies. So foreign students, we call them foreign students, but they're studying for 5, 6, 7 years in Ukraine. And many of them do bachelor's degrees, master's degrees. Some of them do doctoral degrees in Ukraine. And so they often become embedded in these communities that they're studying in. And so when we think about foreign students and we see these pictures of them, trying to get to the border, we have to kind of put this into a greater context of what these foreign students mean to the communities they come from, but also why they're going to Ukraine. So early on in the war, I think probably within a week on social media, we started seeing, it was about 3 or 4 of the same videos. And these videos were showing African students, particularly male African students, being accosted by border guards along the Ukrainian-Polish border, who they're being pushed to the end of the line. You also have videos of refugees of color talking about standing in line for hours, not having food, not having water. And you also have instances of accusations of racism, not even at the border, but for Africans trying to get to the border, being pushed off of trains, not being allowed onto buses. And so this is kind of when this topic blew up in terms of international media coverage and also on social media. And actually, I did an interview the evening before the war started, and a reporter asked me, if Russia does invade, how could this affect the Black community of Ukraine? And I said, it will be significantly worse. The refugee crisis that will follow will be worse for people of color. And unfortunately, I was right. And it's because I understand the levels and the ways in which race affects the lives of these people every day, but also how so often in times of war, existing social and cultural cleavages become worse. These problems become worse. And so this picture here is from students of color who are at the border. I believe they're at the border with Ukraine. And so you have some Ukrainians, you have many African students. And so the way that this problem was portrayed in the media, particularly in the United States and in the West, is everyone was circulating the same 3 or 4 videos. And so that kind of framed the question, I would argue, wrong. The question of the refugee crisis and how it affected students of color, particularly African students, is really a 3-pronged problem. You have the problem of getting across the border, particularly the border with Poland. That's one prong. The second prong is getting to the border, getting access to transportation to any particular village or city you were in to get to Kiev and then get to Lviv to get across the border. And then the third prong of this problem is the problem of being stuck. And that's the problem I'll talk about later. So when we think about what was going on at the border, you did have instances of Africans, but also Middle Eastern and Indian students being denied access to cross the border. So the initial stages of the war, you have a humanitarian crisis, but you also have a diplomatic crisis. Many of these African students came from countries that did not have diplomatic or embassy presence. So this is before the EU had established very clear lines and very clear rules for how people are going to be able to get across the border. The EU initially opened its border, particularly the Polish border and the Hungarian borders, to Ukrainians. So people who held Ukrainian passports, they could get through. If you weren't from those two countries, if you weren't from Ukraine, you had significant issues trying to get across the border. India and Nigeria in particular were better at getting their students across the border because they had embassy presence in Poland and in Hungary. So they could deal with these issues on the border and could get help there as soon as they could. So that's one issue, is it's also a diplomatic issue. But also we have the issue of race. And so when we think about these stories and these instances of racism, you do have people being pushed to the back of the line, people being skipped over. And the problem is, if you don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, and many of these students don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, a lot of their instruction is in English, they have no way of communicating with the officers at the border who speak Polish or Ukrainian or even Russian. And the people at the border have no way of communicating with them. So you have communication issues that kind of make these issues of race even worse. But often, this also became understood as segregation, because all the people of color were put to one side of a line, and then the people who were Ukrainian were put to another line, and they were allowed to go through. And so this works 2 ways. One, if you're an Afro-Ukrainian, which means you have a Ukrainian passport, you were put in a line with people who weren't Ukrainians. They thought because of your skin color, you were not Ukrainian. So that's one aspect of this that I don't think anyone's talked about, is how, in particular, splitting people based on color could actually do harm to Roma Ukrainians and Afro-Ukrainians who do have Ukrainian passports who weren't allowed to cross through. But secondly, this is interpreted as segregation when oftentimes, according to the people who were working the border stations, it was the easiest way to figure out who was Ukrainian and who wasn't. And so I think the context of the conflict and the crisis at the border, when they were completely overwhelmed and undermanned those first 3 weeks, is important to remember. So I think there are more reasons why we could say, we could look at other things besides racism to kind of see and understand what's going on at the border. But the second problem is when we get to trying to cross, trying to get to Kyiv and Lviv. And so this becomes the issue. So a key part of this war and what people were allowed to do and weren't allowed to do, Ukrainian men from ages 18 to 60, I believe, were not allowed to leave Ukraine. They are not allowed to leave Ukraine because they can be called up to fight. And so you have these harrowing images of Ukrainian men leaving their mothers, their daughters, their wives, their families at train stations, putting them on trains, and then having to turn back to fight. So I think this is a key part to understand why you have a lot of these videos where they're not allowing African men in particular onto the trains, is because men aren't supposed to be leaving. But you also have pushback. You also have this anger towards African and Indian and Middle Eastern male students because people were saying, you study here, but you won't fight for this country. So you have this mixing of angst and anxiety and fear that's being directed towards people of color. But on the flip side, you also have many instances in which African women and children were not allowed on trains, were not allowed on buses that were leaving villages and cities to go towards Lviv and then eventually across the border. And that's because of racism. They're women and children. They should be allowed to leave, and they're not being allowed to leave, or they're being manhandled. They're being pushed to the end of the line. So we have the situation where war has already made worse already existing racial problems and instances of anti-Black discrimination. So this is a picture. These are Africans. I believe they're waiting outside of Lviv to get onto the train to go towards the border with Poland. And then finally, of the three-pronged problem, we have this other problem of Sumy, which is an example. The people who are left behind. Many thousands of students were not able to evacuate. And so this is where the internet took and the social media really took a dark turn. So I was personally in contact and working with foreign students who were trapped in Sumy. I was talking to African students, I was talking to Indian students, I was talking to students from Afghanistan. So you have a very wide breadth of students who are at Sumy. It was a Sumy State University, most of them were medical students. And so it was harrowing. Sumy was under siege by the Russian forces for well over 2 weeks. They bombed the public works, so there was no water for days, there's no electricity for days, and often the students were staying in this picture, underground in bomb shelters. And so what started to happen was, one, I was working with Sumy Ukrainians who lived in Sumy who were able to get to the university to help out, but a lot of foreign students were going without food. So that was what I was doing, was helping them get food and helping them get resources, but also just letting the university know where some of these students were. If they weren't staying in the student dorms, there was no way of keeping track with them, if the electricity is out. So you have the logistical issues, and then you have this humanitarian crisis of Sumy in general, the entire city with, I think over 200,000 people. There's very little water. They're running out of food. They don't have electricity. And so during the Russian siege of Sumy, you started to see these videos come out. There are 2 or 3 that came out that were shared by hundreds of thousands of people on the internet. And it's about these 2 groups of African students who are angry, and they're in their videos and they're saying they're holding us hostage. They won't let us out of, these universities because they are holding us hostage because they know if they let the foreign students go, then Russia's going to start bombing. And this blew up over the internet, and then the hashtag was like African students in Ukraine, Africans in Sumy. And I got to see firsthand how that shaped and harmed many of the foreign students who were in Sumy. Because the problem was, it wasn't just foreign people who weren't able to get out of Sumy. No one was able to get out of Sumy. Whenever there would be talks about a ceasefire or a humanitarian corridor, those would fall apart. And I know personally three Turkish students who tried to leave. They couldn't take it anymore, and they tried to leave, and they were shot at by Russian soldiers. They sent me pictures of their bags with bullet holes in them, of graze wounds on their clothing. So this was a problem of, if you already are under siege by Russian forces, being a visible minority simply compounds the atrocities that could be possible. So you have this problem of no one can leave. You have this problem of students who are traumatized, who are in shock, who are incredibly afraid, are making these videos out of fear, and those videos are being posted all around the world. And then you have the problem of they're in communications with their families who are not in Ukraine, who are seeing these videos and who are hearing these rumors, and who are saying, there's going to be a humanitarian corridor, just leave. And so people like me who were, I was in America, I was working with people on the ground who were trying to explain to them, these aren't true, these are rumors, you can't go out now, the sirens are out, you have to, protect yourself. It was really harrowing to see people manipulating the really tough situation that these students were in. And I warned and I said, we have to be very careful with how we discuss and approach instances of racism during this war, because Russia will take advantage of it. And that's exactly what happened. A couple of days after one of these videos was posted, the Russian Foreign Ministry reposted it and on its English language account and said, essentially, look at how Ukraine treats foreign students. Look at them holding foreign students hostage. And I just wanted to scream, I'm like, why do you think they're stuck? It's because Russia controls Sumy. And so I saw that, and I saw how hard it was for these students, and things were really dire. But luckily, a humanitarian corridor did open. All of the foreign students I was in contact with were able to get out. Most of them, I think the majority of them actually have returned home. Many of them are in India or in Nigeria, but some of them also transited through. And so they are in Poland or in Hungary or in Germany. And so when we think about this question of the treatment of Africans and foreign students in Ukraine, I think approaching it as a three-pronged problem makes it easier for everyone to understand the myriad of issues that are being faced there, but also to understand these students have gone through unimaginable suffering, just as the Ukrainian citizens of Sumy were. And so something I noticed, I did a ton of interviews after the war started, particularly in early March, and I kept getting media requests, and people said, can we talk to students? Do you know any students? Do you want to talk to students who've experienced racism? And honestly, from my experience with these students, most of them did not experience racism. When they were in Sumy, when they were getting out, when they were getting onto trains to go to Lviv, when they were in Lviv and they crossed the border, because by that time, the border had become much more regulated. There was a lot more staff there. There was more help there. So what I found is like people didn't want to interview the students I was suggesting who were okay and willing to talk because they didn't have, besides the harrowing experience of living in a city under Russian siege, they hadn't experienced racism. So I think we have to also temper kind of what we expect to hear, because for many people, your experience with racism depends on not only your skin color and your nationality, but also where you are. If you're in Sumy or Kherson or Kharkiv or Odessa, these are all very different locations in Ukraine who have very different histories with and backgrounds with international people. I had no problems when I was in Odessa. Nothing racist happened to me when I was in Odessa. But when I was in Kiev, I ran into a group of skinheads. So it depends on where you are. And so it also, I think, and this is what my research is interested in, it depends on where you come from and your positionality and how you understand what it means to be Black, where you come from versus where you are in a new place, particularly in the former Soviet Union. And so when we think about what's left, because the war's been happening for 2 months, and think about how often you have heard about African or foreign students in the media since March 15th. You haven't heard much because the initial stories of racism died down, but there were hundreds of students who were left, and most of those students have actually gotten out of Ukraine. But many of the students, so about 12 of the students I was in contact with, they want to come back to Ukraine. They want to finish their studies. And so when we think about the refugee crisis, and I think over they're predicting about 8 million people will try to leave Ukraine, or 8 million Ukrainians have left. We don't get the broad spectrum of experience after people have left Ukraine. I'm in groups that are working in particular in Hungary with the African students who are still in Hungary. Thousands of them are in Hungary. And so if you weren't from Nigeria or Ghana, those two countries, particularly Nigeria, had government funds and they paid for planes to take their students back to Nigeria. If you're from a country like the Central African Republic or Cameroon, your government didn't have the embassy or the resources to bring you back, but also many students want to finish their studies. And so now we've seen these new initiatives in the United States in particular to help students from Ukraine to finish their studies or to do graduate studies. And that's great. And I totally support that. And we need that. But then the question becomes, what about those third country nationals who don't have Ukrainian passports, but their studies were still interrupted? And so we have to think about that. Medical school in Ukraine and Eastern Europe looks different from medical school in the United States. Same for law school and for different types of technical training. So for many of these foreign students, they want to stay in Poland or go back to Ukraine so they can finish their studies because it makes the most sense. They don't have to restart, but also visa regimes. The EU has established temporary protection for Ukrainians. So Ukrainians can stay in EU countries for up to 3 years. They get access to medical care, they get access to education, they get access employment. But before the war, Ukrainians only had 90 days of visa-free stay in the EU. So I think when we think about the refugee crisis and what that means for Ukrainians, and we're celebrating Europe welcoming and opening its doors to Ukrainians, what I have said online and I'll say here is keep this in perspective. This opening of the borders to Ukrainians is very recent, as of 2022. In 2014, when Russia invaded Luhansk and Donetsk, supported pro-Russian forces in Donetsk and Luhansk, when it forcibly annexed Crimea, those borders were not open to Ukrainians. And so what we're seeing in terms of inequality and treatment of refugees, the welcoming to Ukrainians is new, but also if we look at the American response to the refugee crisis, it's also very interesting. So President Biden has promised that I think the United States will accept up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, but also a problem is I think over 15,000, it was in a Washington Post article a week ago, 15,000 Ukrainians have already left and gone to America. They're at the southern border between Mexico and America. They don't have permission to enter into the United States. So you have thousands of Ukrainians influxing at the border. And so I think the Biden administration announced today or yesterday that they're going to they're working on a plan to allow up to, I think the number, so the 100,000, but of that 100,000, there are requirements. So it's not just any Ukrainian can come into the United States. You have to have a sponsor. And then with that sponsor, if you pass security checks, but also you pass the vaccination requirements, then you can stay in the United States for up to 2 years. So our visa regime and our ability to take in refugees does look different than Western Europe, particularly EU countries. But that's also because of the United States government. It works a little bit differently. But I think what we've seen in terms of the dialogues about the refugee crisis has put on display a lot of the worrying effects of kind of anti-refugee and anti-immigrant dialogue that we've seen in the United States, but also across Western and Eastern Europe. The first 2 weeks of the war, there were constant discussions in the media about how these Ukrainian refugees are different. The Bulgarian Prime Minister, Kirill Petkov, he essentially said, they're like us. They're not like the refugees we're used to. And then there was a member, I think it was on CBS, he said the Ukrainian refugees, they're relatively civilized, they're relatively European. So these comments, these things that people are saying about Ukrainians, one, it shows a very clear line of how race and ethnicity shape which refugees are welcome and which refugees are not welcome. But also I think it obscures that for the longest time, Ukraine was not included in that. Ukraine being relatively civilized is new. If you look at even the Brexit discourse in the United Kingdom, a lot of that discourse was stereotyping and using hurtful stereotypes about Eastern European people, particularly Poles and Ukrainians and Russians, to be a reason for why the UK wanted to leave the EU. So if you only started paying attention to this part of the world in February 2022, a lot of these nuances are lost. And I think that's kind of been one of the most enraging and interesting things to see is how these have been interpreted and kind of used, particularly in social media and as well by the Russian government. So the final thing I want to say is what's at stake here? If we think about what does it mean? What does this war mean for Ukrainians, but also for people of color in Ukraine? The Roma, the thousands of Roma who are also Ukrainian, the untold numbers of Afro-Ukrainians. We don't have numbers because in Ukraine and in Russia and much of the former Soviet Union, when you do the census, you don't check a race box, so you can't claim being an Afro-Ukrainian. But also Ukraine has not had a census since I think 2001 or 2002. They were supposed to have a census in 2022. So what happens to these people? And this is the problem about having a census. All of these people, so many of them are unaccounted for. And so we think about the refugee crisis, many of these people want to return, but what can they return to? The destruction that Russia has done to Ukraine, but also how will the Russian invasion shape Ukrainian nationalism, and who's accepted as a Ukrainian, who's not accepted as a Ukrainian. So I think there are a lot of things that this war has put on display. And I think a lot of that is being interpreted in interesting ways, but also there are some very hurtful discourses against Ukrainians. Ukrainians did not ask for this invasion. They didn't ask for special treatment at the EU border. That special treatment didn't exist for them in January 2022, the way it does now, right? And so I try to approach my work, but also my research on what's been happening in Ukraine. Literally, I was kind of thrown into the Sumy situation because a student's family member reached out to me on Twitter and asked if I could help. And that's kind of how I've gotten into it. But I'm trying to approach this with humanity, but also to use my historical training and my research on race in the former Soviet Union to kind of explain and contextualize a lot of these different discourses that we're seeing. Because my worry is, as we're in the second month of this war, the media will become exhausted. It happens. But these Africans, these Indians, these Middle Eastern students, these Syrian refugees who moved to Ukraine, who are now being, reharmed and having to leave again. The Uyghurs who have left China, who are studying in Ukraine and living in Ukraine as refugees, they're now being harmed again. They're made refugees again. And so all of these people who are part of Ukraine, who are part of the Ukrainian community, they're kind of being washed out and left out in these discourses. So I want to keep reminding people that they exist, that they're important, and that when we think about this war, we have to also think about them. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was really fantastic. I certainly remember following you from the beginning of the war on Twitter, and particularly with these students in Sumy, almost holding my breath day by day as I watched you, try to help them navigate their way out of the country. So I'm gonna actually put into the chat box for everybody Kimberly's Twitter feed. She is well worth following and a tremendous expert on not just these issues, but all issues actually related to the war in Ukraine. I'm sure a lot of you have seen Kimberly on CNN, MSNBC, other channels along the way. And it always makes me feel good to know that you're in my profession and that you're the voice that we're hearing at times on those kinds of stations. And following up on the last point that you were talking about, one of our attendees, Roger Jones, who happens to be one of my students this semester, says, are foreign students suffering from some PTSD that has been exacerbated by trauma from their country of origin? And I was thinking in particular, some of what you were just talking about people who have, sometimes fled somewhere else to wind up in Ukraine to then have to flee again. So I was wondering if you could answer his question for us.
Yes, that is an excellent question. And it's an important question. And it's one people are not talking about. And so this comes to, for example, a lot of the national media wanted access to African students who had just fled Ukraine, or Indian students, or like the group of Turkish students I was talking about who have been shot at. They wanted to talk to them. And I'm having to explain they don't want to, right? They are in a, they're in Poland or they're in Hungary, they don't speak the language. And so for a few of these students, like students from the Central African Republic who lived through civil war, they have been re-traumatized. So they have PTSD, and they aren't given the time to process what they've been through. And it's not just, okay, I've made it out of Ukraine, I'm safe. That often isn't the case. Like there are a lot of what's happening on the ground in Hungary and in Poland in particular, because they've taken so many refugees. A lot of this is NGOs and people on the ground who are opening their homes and opening their churches to these groups of people. And so you may have made it through Ukraine, but now you're in a makeshift refugee camp in a church. So you still can't really process what's happened to you. So I would argue, like, yes, PTSD, being re-traumatized, is definitely what's happened to many students, but also many students are experiencing new forms of PTSD. And for not just the students, but I mean, Ukrainians across the board. And I haven't seen people talk about that, the emotional and physical and spiritual toll of this war on the refugees.
Thanks. Ata Gould asks, she says, you mentioned that the requirements for taking refugees is different between the United States and the European Union. Could you talk a little bit more about what those differences are?
Sure. So the key aspect, the EU did this temporary protection directive shortly after the war started. And so if you are a Ukrainian, holds a Ukrainian passport, you were able to go into any EU country in theory, and you were able to stay for 3 years. But at the initial stage of the war, and this often happens in wars, it's not just this one, people flee to the country next door, right? That's generally what happens. So that's why you saw such a huge influx of people going into Poland and Hungary. And so Poland, I think Poland took over 2 million people, an incredible amount of people in a short period of time. I mean, Warsaw, its population doubled within a week. And so the EU initially, at the first 2 weeks of the war, they hadn't opened up yet. And so seeing Poland and Hungary being overwhelmed, that's when you see this greater opening of the EU for Ukrainian refugees. And so this is also the benefit of the EU, because you have the Council of Europe. And so when they decide something, it goes to effect for all of the EU countries. So that's one of the things this kind of supranational collective does better, because it's, this head of decision making. In the United States, it's completely different. So the United States, what the Biden administration is doing, I think it's called, it's like a form of humanitarian parole, essentially, for Ukrainians, to kind of open it up to Ukrainians to be able to cross the border, but that has not happened yet. So there are a minimum, I think this is as of a week ago, 15,000 Ukrainians who are still at the border. But even within that, there are differences at the border in terms of how Ukrainians are treated versus how people from Haiti and Mexico and South America are treated. They're often put in different spaces and in different camps. And you have a lot more volunteers working with the Ukrainian refugees than with the other refugees. But also it's different because Ukrainians can claim refugee status, whereas people from Haiti or from Mexico or Colombia may not be able to do that. And so those are some very big differences that are also completely informed by domestic politics. My last example for this is in December, there was a humanitarian crisis at the Belarus and Polish border, Syrian refugees. And they were out, thousands of them were out starving and, freezing to death along the Belarus and Polish border, because Belarus is they wouldn't allow the Syrians to stay, and they're forcing the Syrians to go into Poland. So Poland kind of had this two-pronged humanitarian crisis at its northern border with Belarus, with Syrians, and then at its western and southern borders with Ukraine. And my worry is, I don't know what happened to those Syrian refugees who were at the Belarus and Polish border because the war started. So that's kind of something I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And I think this question of how we continue to follow people and what's happening with them, once they have left is certainly something that, you've indicated is more difficult in a lot of ways. And I just think, I know that there was a viral video that was going around that I saw of some males of color, men of color, who I think were being refused permission to go with their Ukrainian wives to maybe the UK or something like this. Mm-hmm. And so clearly these issues that you're talking about don't stop at all when they get outside of the borders of Ukraine.
Exactly.
Yeah. let me ask here. So we have a slightly longer question. I'll read it and I'll also share it so folks can see it, from Christine Emeron. It says, can you discuss the role of intergovernmental actors like the UN to condemn racism of foreign students trying to flee the Russo-Ukrainian war, and also global civil rights lawyers' lawsuit on behalf of these students, and the role there on improving the conditions to evacuate the students? How did this affect these countries of international student support or not for the Russo-Ukrainian war? In addition, how have views of war and inequalities of guests versus refugees and the response of neighboring countries to welcome or not these people who have left, as seen in Eastern Europe? I know there are a number of different things here, but just some of your thoughts.
I pulled up the question so I can see it.
Yeah.
So I think I'm still trying to weigh what exactly international attention did. The good thing is the early international attention. So you had the Ukrainian foreign minister come out and make a statement about and creating a hotline for foreign students to call if they had any issues at the border to address those issues. And then you have the UN condemning racism against foreign students trying to flee Ukraine. But that's all well and good, but that doesn't necessarily help you on the ground. And so honestly, what I've seen and what I'm, talking to people who've experienced it, the incidence of racism go down considerably within 2 or 3 weeks of the war starting. And that's because the situation at the border improved so much. But what was interesting, and this is what's not being talked about, is what happens after you cross into Poland and Slovakia and Hungary. 3 countries, particularly Hungary and Poland, which have had an amazing rise of the far right and of, racist gangs, and people of color in Hungary and Poland have had issues of racism. And so you have people targeting foreign students, particularly African students in Hungary and in Poland after they crossed the border. So I had students in Sumy and I'm telling them, go to Romania. We need to get you to Romania because I have contacts in Romania. I know Romania is safe. I can't guarantee your safety in Poland. Right. And so I think that's important too. So in terms of international student support for the Russo-Ukrainian war, this is interesting. And this is where I think social media can be incredibly bad. Russia is very good at using instances of racism for its own good. And I am a historian of the Soviet Union, particularly the 20s and 30s. So so what we saw with that Russian foreign ministry tweet and the increase in Russian bots, and they're all retweeting the same 3 or 4 videos. And it drummed up a lot of anger and righteous anger. But then you start seeing this huge swath of people who are now like, Ukraine deserves this. If you're gonna be racist during a war, you deserve this. I'm not gonna help you. This is not a Black problem. I don't care about this country. Or what really burned me is people saying Russia's not racist and Ukraine is, or saying yeah, they need to denazify that country. And as a Black woman who has worked on the Soviet Union since I was 18 years old, let me explain this in the clearest way possible. Russia is worse than Ukraine when it comes to issues of racism. There's a reason why I chose Ukraine to work on my master's thesis and not Russia. And so, but what happened is this became, well, Russia's right. It is denazifying this country. And also this goes into these other instances, people saying, well, Russia wasn't an imperial country because Russia wasn't involved in the scramble for Africa. And as a trained Russian and Soviet historian, I'm just screaming at the top of my lungs, 11 time zones. How do you think a country gets that big? They weren't just asking Siberians if they could take their countries, right? So I think in many ways, the war and these instances of racism have shown what many of us who work on the field have been trying to talk about. This is colonialism. This is about decolonialism. This is about racism. These instances, all these things exist in Europe. And now they're being shown in Eastern Europe, but they're being highlighted in ways that I think are not necessarily beneficial for the Ukrainian war effort. And I think that was why it was important for the Ukrainian foreign minister to come out and say something, because I think he understood you can't have this.
Let me ask a question from Pearl Matiba. President Zelensky is asked to address the African Union, made his request earlier this month. What do you think people of African descent would like to hear from him on their treatment in fleeing from Ukraine? He wants support from African countries at the UN, but hasn't really said much about Africa's importance or role in the war. What are your thoughts?
This is an interesting question. And I think, so Zelensky would have to address racism, clearly. But I also think it's important to, and I got attacked online for saying this, we also have to remember how many African students also had good experiences in Ukraine. There's a reason why thousands of African students study in Ukraine and not in Russia. And so I think he needs to also highlight that Ukraine and Africa have had a long 80-year history, and Ukrainians, many African students who went back to Africa, who were community leaders, who work in the government, they studied in Ukraine. So he needs to emphasize these long-standing ties. But I also think, and I hope, Zelensky understands that many countries, many members of the AU are in a tough situation because they're dependent on Russia for food. So the food crisis, because I mean, Russia and Ukraine are two of the world's biggest suppliers of grain, sunflower oil to developing countries, the third world, the global south. So if you're a member of the AU and you're dependent on Russia for grain, you can't just deny Russia because they'll starve you. Russia will starve you. So I think he has to walk a very clear line, a very tight line, but also I think he understands the position of Africa and members of the AU. And I think that's why when he talks and when he gives these speeches, he's hitting so hard on Europe, because Europe has power that members of the AU doesn't or don't.
Thanks. Can you clarify just from one question that's in the chat from Ludmila Lanik? She mentions 6,000 foreign students, but I think actually you said 76,000 foreign students, if I remember right.
76,000.
And can you tell us where that data came from?
It's from the Ukrainian government on their studyinukraine.gov.ua website. And so it's kind of like the government's website. I think it's from 2020. And it's them trying to recruit, more foreign students. So that's from them. And unfortunately, the number has changed, of course. But I think the second biggest country, I think it was Morocco. And I think Nigeria was the first African country with the most students. They had a few thousand. But many are from Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, former Soviet, particularly Soviet Central Asia. And that's because it is much better to be Central Asian in Ukraine than in Russia.
You mentioned, by the way, that a lot of these students were studying in English and don't speak Ukrainian. Is this the case with most foreign students who are studying in Ukraine? Or do some come there and study either in Ukrainian and Russian and some other language?
I think so. For many of the students who are in medical school, English is the language of instruction, but for technical school, it's English. And depending on where you are and depending on what year, it was Russian or Ukrainian. And so another issue is, so if you know Russian or Ukrainian, particularly if you only know Russian, if you go on to Poland, that's a whole different situation. And I know Russian, I'm learning Ukrainian. There are a lot of, they're not as close as people think they are. So the language issue is interesting because I didn't even know that many of them were studying in English until I was talking to students. I was like, oh, I've just presumed you spoke Russian or Ukrainian, but many of them, they only speak English, or if they come from China or Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Russian. But if you're from Morocco or somewhere like that, English is kind of the language that flattens everything.
Great. Roger Jones asked if you've seen people of color fighting for Ukraine, I presume here, and if so, do they fight in semi-segregated units?
So this has been interesting. I haven't seen this, but that doesn't mean they don't exist, right? So I mean, they did this interview with Jean Pelanuk, and he was cleaning pistols on his desk because he's a member of the Ukrainian government, but also he knew because of his skin color, there's a price on his head. And so I don't know, but also, and this is just being honest, if you are the Ukrainian military, it may not be beneficial for you to have people of color fighting for you because they're very easy marks. We're visible minorities. And so it's been interesting to see that, but I have seen pictures of Turkish and Uzbek people fighting in for Ukraine. But if you're from the region, and this is one of the legacies of the Soviet Union, it's very easy to tell if someone's from Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan. So there are people who are visible minorities who are fighting. I just don't know how many people of color, but that's a good question.
Gotcha. So we're kind of running out of time. A couple of questions that I'd still love to ask. Paul Abushan asks, are there any mutual aid organizations that we can support who are directly helping these refugees?
Yes, I actually have in my Twitter bio, I have a link tree. It was early in the war, and I was getting requests for help from so many different kinds of people. So I put together a link tree, and I have help, and I've like verified it for people of color, for students who are still fleeing Ukraine, for people who are LGBTQ, but also for people who have disabilities. So I try to put together as many different types of resources as possible. So if you go to my Twitter profile, it's my pinned tweet is my link tree, and it has all the different things.
That's why I wanted to ask you the question. I knew the answer, but I knew you were going to mention that. But I'm glad, because it's good that people know that it's out there, that they can find this information. So that's great. You know, among the many great things that you've done, putting that together, a lot of work, but very useful. Why don't we make this our last question? Sarah Swift says that she'd love to hear more about you studying abroad in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, and asks in particular if you have articles or media that you've written about your travel experiences at all.
Yes, I did a piece for AC's Newsnet, and it's about my time as a Black woman in Ukraine. I've also written for The Conversationalist about my time in Serbia and Bulgaria, two very different experiences. So I will, and I think those are all on my website. But yeah, I have written about them because I'm a very strange person. Like, when I'm Black and I studied the Soviet Union, but also I am from rural Texas, if you can't tell from my accent. So like, I joke that like I studied peasants because I am a peasant. But so that's where, if you're interested in that, that's where a lot of my work is. It's on my website, all the things I've written.
Wonderful. Kimberly, thank you so much. You know, this has been absolutely fantastic. I had heard you speak, I think, early after the war began. You gave a talk to your history department there at UPenn, and I was able to listen in on Zoom. And I knew immediately at that moment that I really wanted you to come and talk to our George Mason community. And I can't tell you how proud it makes me of my profession to have somebody like you in it. And so we're just so grateful to have had you here. Niklas, I'll leave you with the last word if you would like.
I don't know how I can top your last words, and I'm not a trained historian, so I can't claim any sort of like credit. But let me just second the thanks, and also you're getting thanks in the Q&A. And I think this was, as a non-historian, I do really appreciate that you took the time to come and visit us and talk to us about Ukraine and everything. So thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Look for us definitely to have more events, possibly over the summer. We'll see. Of course, universities in the summer is always a problem to continue our work. But at the very least, we obviously want to continue these conversations in the fall. Really important that we not stop talking about this, that we don't let the American public become tired of it and become bored with it, that we continue these conversations. Thank you again, Kimberly. Thank you, Niklas. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.